I'm very pleased to introduce the creative team behind the film. We don't have Chris Farrell with us tonight, but he's a great producer who worked very hard on making this all happen. We do have director Mary Wharton, who is an award-winning filmmaker with passion for music and stories that connect us to the music inside us all. She won the Grammy for Best Music Film for her first feature, Sam Cooke, Legend. Her latest film, Tom Petty, Somewhere You Feel Free, was the centerpiece film for the 2021 South by Southwest Film Festival, where it won the Headliners Audience Award. For television, Mary produced the NBC special Elvis Lives about Elvis Presley, The Beatles Revolution for ABC, the Grammy-winning Wings for Wheels, The Making of Born to Run about Bruce Springsteen as well. She's written, produced, and directed VH1 documentaries about U2, David Bowie, The Doors, Elton John, George Clinton, Jimi Hendrix, Enrique Iglesias, Pitbull, Train, Linda Perry, and LL Cool J. Writer Bill Flanagan is a TV producer, author, music critic, and radio host. He hosts 4 shows on 3 channels on SiriusXM currently, and he is an on-air essayist and contributor to the CBS Sunday Morning Show, for which he's won 3 Emmys. He's the author of 2 books on music, a collection of humor pieces, and 3 novels, including one of which was recently published called 15 Reverse. He's written for Esquire, Rolling Stone, the New York Times, Vanity Fair, GQ, Men's Journal, and the Boston Globe, and he spent 20 years at MTV Networks, where he created and produced the long-running series VH1 Storytellers and CMT Crossroads, as well as 2 live concerts from the Clinton White House. Writer-director Katherine Dieckmann's most recent feature film is Strange Weather, starring Holly Hunter and Carrie Coon. Other films include Motherhood, Diggers, A Good Baby, and that was developed at the Sundance Institute Screenwriting and Directing Labs. Katherine began her career as a journalist, writing on film, books, and music for Rolling Stone, Vogue, The Village Voice, and went on to direct videos for bands including REM, Amy Mann, and Wilco, and more recently, Sharon Von Etten, for whom she directed 2 clips in 2018. As the originating director on the groundbreaking live-action Nickelodeon series, The Adventures of Pete and Pete, with cameos from Iggy Pop and Michael Stipe, among others, Katherine helped develop the show's indie aesthetic and soundtrack. As a professor of professional practice at Columbia University's Graduate School of the Arts film program, Katherine has taught screenwriting for over 2 decades, mentoring countless filmmakers. Thank you all for being here today, and Katherine, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate, who I might also add is the daughter of Bill Flanagan. And
that's how I got this gig.
And I've known Bill since I met him at an REM 10,000 Maniacs concert. That will date us, in 1987. And I've known Kate since she was a little, used to bicycle copy over to Bill's apartment and bit off in the days before email. So we go way back. I'm so honored and excited to be leading this conversation tonight. I think this is just a tremendous documentary and such an amazing moment to be focusing on Jimmy Carter as a figure, who I feel like was very misunderstood, maligned in his time, and has over the years, come to represent something quite different than I think he represented in his time. And so, Mary, I commend you for and Bill for sort of digging into the past and revisiting it through this lens of Carter's relationship to music. And I guess I wanted to start by just sort of generally asking you, Mary, like, how did you 2 come together? What was the sort of the nature of your collaboration? Bill, you wrote it. I also know you did the Q&As and the subjects. And, I think that the film has a very specific construction in terms of like the topics it covers and the way it moves through those topics and creating this portrait of Carter, and a portrait, again, that's very relevant to this moment. So how did you go about kind of figuring out how you're going to sit together and work together?
Well, Mary approached me. It's Mary's the director. It's Mary's project. So Mary, at what point did you get into it? When did this dawn on you?
Well, it wasn't my idea entirely. It was really Chris Farrell. It's a shame that he couldn't join us tonight, but he had been kind of researching the possibility of making a documentary about the Allman Brothers when he was introduced to some of the folks down in Atlanta who worked for Carter, who were in the film, like Peter Conlon and Tom Beard and Frank Moore. And they told him all these stories about Carter. And Chris called me because I think he just sort of instinctively knew that I would respond to this material in the same way that he did. He and I had been talking about working on something together, but we were it was completely unrelated, a whole other topic. And as soon as he told me about it, it was kind of like we just knew the germ of it, of like Carter's relationship with Bob Dylan and Greg Allman and Willie Nelson was basically what I knew going into it. And I just thought that it was such an interesting thing that I didn't really know that anything about it. And it seemed like a good lens to look at Carter and like view him in a different way than I had always viewed him. And one of the things that Bill and I had worked together 20 something years ago back at VH1 in the 90s on the series that Bill created for VH1, Legends. And we did a bunch of documentaries together. And I remember saying to Chris, one of the things that Bill is so great at is being able to kind of see the world in a big picture kind of way and tie together all of these big ideas with music and how music interrelates with the kind of changing world that we live in. And I said, first of all, Bill would be a great writer for this because he would be able to help us connect with some of these musicians that we need for this project. And secondly, but more importantly, I thought that his sort of, the way that he has this ability to connect all the dots in a really interesting way would be quite crucial in kind of developing the ideas of the project. Because to me, it was like only mildly interesting that Carter was friends with Bob Dylan. That's like what do you know? But I knew it needed to be bigger than that to make it be worthy of a feature-length film that's just about this topic, So Bill was the first person that once Chris and I decided to pursue this, Bill was the first person that we brought onto the team. And we had lunch one day somewhere. Where do we have lunch? We had lunch somewhere downtown.
It was at LaGuardia. It isn't there anymore. It's the burger place at LaGuardia.
Oh yeah, oh well. Anyway.
Gone now.
But yeah, so that was kind of the genesis of it was, we got together and we started, throwing around ideas pretty regularly. And Chris and I had written a one-page, kind of treatment that we managed to get to President Carter. And he was really into the idea from the start, and it never would have gotten anywhere without him, personally being into the idea. But I know that it was also vetted by a lot of people in his circle before they agreed to it.
Didn't they say something, Mary, about how many requests they get for Carter to be in different documentaries?
Oh yeah,
that's phenomenal.
They said they get, probably a documentary interview request like at least once a week, if not every day. And the guy who was running the Carter Center at the time, his nickname, we were told, was Dr. No, because he told us, I get a documentary proposal every week and I say no to all of them. And I would have said no to yours, but the president wants to do this. So, that was how it really came forward. And he, it was really adorable that President Carter was so into the idea of being called the rock and roll president that at one point we were even considering changing the title. And we spoke with Carter's grandson, Jason Carter, who's involved with the Carter Center. And he was like, no, you can't change the title. My grandfather loves that. And that was a big part of what made us keep it, was just knowing that President Carter took such delight in being called the rock and roll president.
It's interesting. That was the first thing I saw ask you about, and also have a clip to go with this topic, but I really noticed watching the documentary second time, in fact, he's really not the rock and roll president.
No.
No, but I mean, in terms of his relationship to music, which I think is a really strong part of the piece that you made, you start out really dealing with his relationship to Black music, and particularly growing up in the South, his listening to Mahalia Jackson, and the role music played during the Civil Rights Movement, and his being embedded as a Southerner, a liberal Southerner, during the Civil Rights Movement. I was really struck by the fact that, because I knew about Willie Nelson, and that's in the popular, and it's great to see all that stuff in Dylan and whatever, the Allman Brothers. But what was really revelatory to me was sort of tracking Carter through this relationship with Black music, from gospel in his childhood. And brings me to, you could show the clip when he sponsored the jazz concert at the White House, and what he would say sort of about jazz music, if we play it.
I was deeply infatuated with jazz musicians. So it was a great honor for me and a pleasure to bring to the White House these people that in many cases had not been previously recognized for their great contributions to our society. If there ever was an indigenous art form, one that is special and peculiar to the United States and represents what we are as a country, I would say that it's jazz. At first, this jazz form was not well accepted in respectable circles. I think there was an element of racism, perhaps, at the beginning, because most of the famous early performers were Black, and particularly in the South, to have Black and white musicians playing together was not a normal thing. And I believe that this particular form of music, of art, has done as much as anything to break down those barriers and to let us live and work and play and make beautiful music together.
So yeah, so Mary, I guess, and Bill, both, I'm curious about, was there a moment when you realized that Carter's relationship to music and what it said about him as a person, and kind of as a very pluralistic and expansive figure, which is, I think, increasingly how he seems, is there a moment where it's sort of, where you realization that, like, oh, it's much more than sort of the Dylan, Allman Brothers, the rock and roll lens, but in fact, like, his whole path encompassed so much more than that?
Yeah, I think that when we started talking to President Carter, he was so articulate about where it all came from. And of course, he's born in the 1920s. So rock and roll didn't come along till, he was a grown man with a wife and children. He'd been in the Navy
Right.
and everything else. So, we're using rock and roll the way the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame does, very loosely, to say, where Black and white Southern American music comes together. And, he was changed, as he says, by the gospel music he heard as a child. And, his faith is very strong, always has been a compass in his life. And he, I think, couldn't separate. And in a way, this is what Curtis Mayfield and a lot of R&B songwriters who came around later did, couldn't separate the message of the gospel of inclusion and love with what he was seeing that was contrary to it day to day in the South. So he grew up through the music to have, for the time, a very, very liberal idea about, the racial situation in the South. But as Roseanne Cash says in the documentary, there were a lot of Southerners of his generation, a lot of white Southerners who felt that way. It's kind of been forgotten that there were a lot of heroes in the Democratic and Republican Party in the South, among political leaders and among newspapermen and stuff, who carried the flag for integration.
It certainly, I absolutely echo what Bill says about, it became really clear from the very first interview that Bill did with President Carter, that he was, really passionate about R&B and gospel and jazz in particular. He was incredibly passionate about his love of jazz. But it was also very it was so great as we started to dig into the research to find like that clip of him speaking at the jazz concert and other, you know, moments where you see him at you know, a separate concert. There was the gospel concert, which we show a little bit of, and he's singing along with the gospel artists. He knows obviously all the words to all of the songs they're singing, and just there's another concert that we didn't end up showing in the film, but there was a Chuck Berry performed at the White House lawn on another time, and the look on President Carter's face when he's watching, sitting in the grass watching those concerts is just pure and utter joy, like a kid with a brand new toy, you know, and it's so unforced. And that was what was so rewarding about putting this film together, was what, you know, we did these interviews, and then we had to go out and raise the rest of the money to finish the film. So it took a while between, like, I think we did the interviews in, you know, February, and then it was like, you know, in the summer and fall of that year that we started really getting into the editing, because it took a while to find all of this stuff. And then when you find the piece of archival footage that clicks into place and perfectly illustrates what is being said, it's such a rewarding moment as a filmmaker, where you're just like, all the little pleasure centers in your brain light up, because you're like, oh my God, it's true, it's right there, you know, you can see it, and
We can prove it.
and we had a lot of those little moments in the making of this film, for sure.
So Mary, when you embarked on this, where were we at in terms of the Trump trajectory? Just curious.
The time?
Yeah, I'm just, because I thought, of course, I think as it does now, or, you know, because I can only speak for myself, recovering from a period of time,
Yeah.
but you're also just looking at Carter as almost like the most antithetical man to Trump that you could ever imagine. You know what I mean? In his humanism, in his modesty, in his moral center, is, you know, and I think all of us who were alive when he was president just again remember how he was kind of bashed for being a soft man, right? Talk about that a lot. The whole you know, the Middle East section film and the situation and everything else, you know, that he was sort of, I don't know, stigmatized for not.
Yeah, he was seen as like a peacenik, and it's
Right.
something that people forget. And I was too young when he was president to be aware of this at the time, but President Carter increased military spending every single year of his administration. You know, he was a Navy man. He, you know, yes, he believed in peace. He started an organization, the Carter Center, whose mission is to wage peace. But he also believed in, you know, the notion that we have to have a strong military in America to, you know, foster peace. And so I think he was definitely misunderstood. But we started this production in the beginning of 2018. And so we were smack in the middle of the Trump administration. And, you know, I remember when right after we had done this first batch of interviews, and we were cutting together like a little trailer as kind of a sales tool to pitch investors on the film. And that was at the moment when, you know, they were building those, you know, cages at the border to throw babies into. And it was such a horrific moment for me as an American to be so just horribly ashamed of what my country was doing. And it gave me such hope for the future to be working on this particular project where, you know, you could just see, okay, here was America coming out of Watergate, coming out of a dark period of the Vietnam War and all of the atrocities that happened then. And then along came Jimmy Carter, and he was this beacon of truth and hope and a promoter of peace and honor and American honor. And it was definitely something that gave me a lot of hope for the future in those, you know, sort of dark days. But yeah, we the crazy thing was, as the project went along, you know, we did the film relatively quickly by documentary film standards. It took us, you know, pretty much about a year to finish the whole thing. And we were definitely rushing for a lot of reasons, that we felt like this was a message that America needed to hear right during that time. And, you know, quite frankly, we were worried that something could happen to President Carter. And if he were to die, then all of the, you know, news networks would be putting out documentaries about him, and there would be this, you know, we were worried that someone would sort of beat us to the punch in a way, and then we would not, you know, we would have a more difficult time selling our film. So there were a lot of sort of factors that were weighing on us to kind of, let's just keep this moving, keep it going as fast as we can. And the crazy, and also there was a certain, like, we were like, is this not going to feel relevant in 2 years or after the election, or, you know, we didn't know. And what was so crazy was it just kept being relevant. Like, we would be editing when we were working on the section, the most difficult piece of the film to try to figure out how to tell in a concise way and not get too bogged down, was the Iran hostage crisis, because it's a very complex,
Yeah.
you know, we are scratching the surface in our telling of it. But it was like right then that I was working on editing that piece, and then I would open up the New York Times and it'd be front page, like, you know, some issue with Trump and Iran, or like we'd be working on the piece about, you know, the opening up of relations with China, and then there'd be like trade war with China, you know. It was just like, it just was this total, like, what decade am I in kind of thing that kept happening, where the relevance of it, you know, it just kept continuing to be relevant all the time. And even to the point where, you know, we finished it in the fall of 2019 was when we basically finished the editing, and then we moved on to the mix and the color and all that stuff. And you know, with CNN not airing it until January of 2021, like we were surprised they bought it before, like they could have aired it before the election, but they didn't, because the election is obviously like CNN's, you know, cash cow, essentially. You know, they weren't going to break into election coverage to play a documentary. So I was a little disappointed, like, oh, they're not going to air it until, you know, January of, and it was still relevant even after the election. Like, it was just like this kind of gift that kept giving, in terms of, I guess it's just a story that is strong enough to be relevant, you know, kind of all the time.
Well, I think especially after having, let's say, you know, a president very invested in a certain kind of macho code, to see what the reverse of that looks like. Someone who is actually really proud to be gentle. And I love the whole section of the documentary where you talk about, you know, Carter's kind of embrace of this idea of soft power, right?
We could have done a lot more on soft power. You know, that's one of those subjects that we touched on, but a lot of people talked about, a lot of people in his in his administration who we interviewed talked about. Paul Simon talked about it quite a bit too. That notion that, you know, if you send a country band into Eastern Europe and into the Soviet Union, they will do more to create opportunities for dialogue than, you know, building up more missiles along the NATO border.
Right.
And that was something that Carter understood very well. They also understood it politically, which I think is in the film, that one of his political aides says, you know, if you're wrestling with a congressman of the other party over an appropriations bill, and you can invite him and his family and his mother-in-law and his cousin who's visiting from Oklahoma to come to a concert at the White House with Willie Nelson, it does give you an opportunity to sidle up to him with a glass of lemonade and say, now about that appropriations bill.
Right.
So there was some real politic going on too.
Well, Carter, I mean, clearly understood that from very early on in terms of just how to get the right. I mean, the financing of his campaigns, it came directly out of those relationships.
Well, the concerts, you know, the thing the Carter camp figured out in about 1975 was that the new laws post-Watergate about raising money for campaigns were pretty restrictive. But if someone bought a concert ticket to a fundraiser, it just counted as one $5 donation. In other words, if you played to 10,000 people, it was 10,000 people giving $5 each, not a $50,000 gift. And that's kind of where the momentum with the Allman Brothers concerts for Carter began, and then spread to other artists as his campaign took off.
Well, that's interesting. I just want to ask one more thing about soft power, because I'm sort of intrigued by that concept, but also Bill and Mary, do you think that Carter's sort of unique, well, I don't want to say unique, Carter's particular background, the way he grew up, how he grew up, where he grew up, what was around him when he grew up, you know, influenced or affected his idea of what soft power could be? Because I keep going back to this thing about his, you know, deeply and unaffectedly pluralistic ethic, you know, as just how he approached life. And I somehow in my mind, I think that soft power idea is connected to understanding, or what you just said, Bill, about like, how can you make things happen? You have to, or, you know, seeing John Wayne speak up for Carter, it's like crossing these sort of boundaries, and the culture helps you to do that. Or there's a latitude in terms of how you deal with people who are different from you and try to bring them into a more collective viewpoint.
I think
I think that's true.
There's a great, sorry to interrupt, there, I have to say there's a great Southern expression that I learned from my grandmother, which is you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And I think that's one thing that growing up in the South, I certainly learned how to be diplomatic, how to be, you know, nice, and you know, sort of in order to cajole people in a nice way to get what you want, you know.
Right.
Sometimes you gotta smile real pretty to get what you want, you know, but as long as you're getting what you want in the end, that's, you know, that's kind of the Southern way.
Bill, you did all the interviews with Carter, right? And I'm just curious, in your engagement with him, your direct engagement with him, you know, asking him questions, talking with him, did it change your essential perception of him, or like, what did you come away with having those encounters with him?
I think it, and of course, Mary was there too. Every time Mary was also handing me notes and whispering in my ear.
Right.
So we kind of did
it's a Bill and Mary question then.
Yeah, I think it just confirmed what you hoped he would be, you know, that, I mean, by the way, also he's a guy in his mid-90s. So it was just great that he was alert and articulate, because, you know, that would have been a challenge. But no, I think that it wasn't so much a surprise as it was a confirmation that this was one of the smartest guys you'd ever meet. And that he had he has a consistent worldview. I mean, that in a way you're right about, did the way he grew up, well, the way he grew up affected everything about the way he sees the world. And, you know, it's very, very consistent. It's, you know, a lot of, not just politicians, a lot of people in general, all kinds of people kind of keep their religious beliefs on one side and their political beliefs on the other side and their economic interests over here. I don't think Carter does that at all. I think he is of a whole cloth.
Mary, what did you think? Did your encounters with him, because you conceived of the project and conceived it with Chris, did your encounters with him shift your thinking about him, or affirm original thinking
Yes.
about him?
I mean, the one thing I will say is that, Carter is famous for his smile, and he, with his kind of cardigan sweater, he kind of always, to me, had this like Mr. Rogers kind of vibe. And so I kind of expected him to be a little bit like my grandpa, like my Southern grandpa. And he's not as warm and fuzzy as you think he might be. He's very much a Navy man who, like, he comes, he's a taskmaster, he's ready to get to work. Like, he basically, it's kind of nerve-wracking to go into, the president's office and with the crew, and how it is when you're setting things up, and you think you allow enough time, but it's sort of like we knew we needed to be ready when he walked in the door, and of course he came early, so it's very, like, I think that part of it, that he's certainly a friendly man, and he's certainly, he's not like mean or off-putting, but he's not, he's been a very busy man for a very long time. And so
And he was the commander-in-chief. I mean,
yeah.
he
Exactly.
did command nuclear submarines. And I think there was one time, Mary, I don't remember what it was, but he felt we had switched something on him in the interview we did in Plains.
Oh, yeah, he did. Well,
And you kind of got a sense of he could send you out to scrub the deck in the middle of a thunderstorm
for
if
sure.
you
Like, the
disobeyed an
whole
order.
thing with him coming into the frame and playing records at the beginning, which was my big grand idea for the opening of the film. And I thought we had gotten the okay with his team, that he was all right with that idea, but apparently nobody really told him about it. They were just expecting, me to explain it to him. And it's a funny thing to direct a president, I'll tell you that much. Especially when he was looking at me like, you want me to do what? And I was just like, just walk in and
Just a
like,
little needle drop, just a
make
little
it seem
needle drop.
natural.
Yeah. But I thought it was so great that he's playing Dylan, and that Mr. Tambourine Man, and that also I wondered whether, well, I just inferred this somehow, that his love of Dylan was connected to his poetry and his writing poetry, and I don't know, I just got the feeling that was sort of a muse moment for him, and so maybe that made it okay, or maybe that's just my.
I'm glad that Mary brought the Dylan record and not, Grand Funk Railroad or something. That might have been the end of our whole project.
Well, we
Yeah,
had
certainly.
a bunch of records, and I had hoped that we were gonna get a couple, get him to do a few different records, because I didn't even know that we were going to be able to license that piece of music, which
Yes, I was wondering
a
about
real
that.
problem.
Yeah.
But basically he did it the one time, and it was really clear that he was not interested in doing a second
He was
take.
not interested in working his way through the stack of records that Mary brought.
It was like, okay, let's move on. So I was just like praying that we were gonna be able to license the Bob Dylan song. Otherwise, I was gonna have to go back to the drawing board for how to open my movie.
I mean, Dylan says such beautiful. I was thinking, of course, about Dylan because it was just his birthday, but he says such beautiful things about him. I mean, this clearly the reverence goes both ways. So
Yeah.
That's a real friendship and a real mutual admiration society.
Yeah. Well, I think we're sort of at the time where we might want to turn to questions, because we've got about 20 minutes left. So we have some questions people send in advance, but we would just encourage everyone who's here, if you want to put a question into the chat, anything that you want to ask to Mary or Bill, please put it in the chat and we'll ask it. But one of the questions that we got in advance was from someone named Louise. And the question was, do you think musicians have become afraid to take a political stand? Which I thought was a really interesting question because, well, for a variety of reasons. But anyway, I'm just curious what you guys think about that. I'm assuming she means today, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think Black Lives Matter has produced a tremendous amount of music. I think the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan produced a tremendous amount of music. Certainly 9/11 produced a lot of, music across this, from "We'll Put a Boot in His Ass, It's the American Way" to Steve Earle singing American Taliban. So, the big protest songs were very rarely actually hit singles.
Right.
The Times They Were Changing was not a hit single. You've got Ohio, you've got Give Peace a Chance, you got What's Going On. But for the most part, I don't think there's ever been an era when topical songs were dominating the charts or anything. So I think it's kind of constant. I think it's pretty consistent. And I think that in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of really good topical songwriting.
But I wonder whether it works in the same way. I guess part of the question is like, the songs you mentioned are all anthemic songs. We would hear them on the radio. We own vinyl. You know what I mean? There was a certain kind of
well, there was a counterculture.
Exactly. It was a specific counterculture, but it was also sort of a tactile counterculture. And now there's so much music. Everything's so diffuse, and also everything's like in your ears.
Well, music itself may not be at the center of the culture
Right.
the way it seemed to be in the 60s and, let's say, for the first half of the 70s. But on the other hand, that may be just us thinking that because that's when we were young and most open to music. And someone who's 19 years old today and going to college and getting involved with causes may have a whole playlist of songs.
Sure.
That they take out with them.
Yeah. Mary, what do you think about that? What do you think about the question of?
Well, I think it's interesting because, like Bill says, the culture has changed where there isn't this sort of monolithic rock and roll being the dominant cultural driver of, and the sort of, the rock and roll audiences being the vast majority of music consumers, being, the boomer generation. Now you have, a lot more diverse audiences consuming music. You have, hip hop is one of the more dominant musical forms in terms of popular music now. And like you said, Patty, I think the musical landscape has gotten a lot more kind of splintered into, even within rock and roll, there are so many subgenres of, indie rock and you have artists that are very popular in their world, whether it's Cat Power or Saint Vincent or those kinds of artists, but they're not necessarily on the top 40 charts in and of themselves. And and then you have artists like Patti Smith who's still singing People Got the Power at every concert, I'm sure, but I think that it is interesting that we look to rock stars to somehow make a statement for us. And I've been curious to see, like, will musicians, come forward, for example, to proclaim their vaccination status, as a kind of, will that be a cultural marker in a way, as we try to move forward out of this pandemic. I think that the culture has, when you look at like what is leading the culture right now, is it TikTok stars or who are making 15-second dance videos, and or I think there's a lot of like identity issues dealing with sexuality and where you fall on the, you know, that sort of gender spectrum that are being discussed on TikTok and being, you know, just throughout social media. I think it's just like it's such a, people are so, your attentions is diverted in so many different ways that I don't think that music has the same kind of dominant, like one song. It's so much harder.
No, it definitely doesn't. I mean, it definitely doesn't. You know, it's not, and it's not a value judgment. It's not like a better or worse. It's just a different landscape.
Yeah, it's different. But I hope that, you know, I think that musicians will always be somewhat cultural heroes in some way or another, because they're cool, and you know, everyone loves music. And you know, I think that it is important that people, you know, take a stand. I mean, I thank God for Dolly Parton, you know, every day for you know, talking about the vaccine and putting her money where her mouth is, you know.
Yep.
Um,
There's a question from the audience in the chat. Why did you decide to use Carter's poems in the film? I thought they were incredible. I'd never heard them before, so.
that was Bill's idea, and you know.
Well, you know, it seemed like since he was a poet and since he wrote in rhymed verse like a songwriter, it would be good to kind of have his creative voice in there. And, you know, it was the equivalent of if it had been a different person, we would have had him pick up the guitar and sing a song, but it was Jimmy Carter. So we had him read his poems, and we had other people read his poems too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I liked it when you went from what was it, Nile Rodgers was reading, and then Willie Nelson took over.
Oh, that was Mary's idea. That was pretty smart. That was pretty
very
good.
nice.
Because it was a poem about race in the South, and
Yeah.
to begin with a black musician and then go to a country white musician, I
Yeah.
thought made it twice as good.
Yeah, I liked it too. Bill, a question that was given for you in advance was like, can you talk a little bit, and it's for Mary too, because I don't want to assume that Bill worked this out, but how did you get all the interviews that you got, you know, Bono and Dylan and Jan Wenner, and you got a really nice, was it because people wanted to be associated with Carter in the documentary, or kind of how did that happen?
Yeah, I think it was because of Carter. Certainly Dylan was, you know, I mean, we called Dylan's office and told him about the project, and, you know, his manager said, well, I'll take it to Bob, but Bob, you know, like Jimmy Carter gets these requests every day. And the answer came back, no, you know, he doesn't feel he knows enough about politics, and in particular the Carter administration. So then we went back and just said, you know, it means a lot to President Carter. It's not a favor for us, it's a favor for him. And I think that Bob Dylan wanted to do right by Jimmy Carter. So he made an exception to his usual rule. And the other people were easy. I don't think any of the other people were very challenging. You know, Jan Wenner not only gave us his office, we did Roseanne Cash and who else? Jimmy Buffett. We did a number of interviews in Jan Wenner's office. So everybody else was happy to be involved, I think.
Was there anyone you wished you could have talked to about Carter? Like, I was thinking about how he said that he particularly wanted to have Paul Simon and Aretha Franklin at his inauguration. Do you wish you'd gotten to interview her, for instance, or were there other people? Or I wondered why, you know,
Aretha would have been at the top of the list, you know.
Yeah.
But Aretha was not in good health by the time we were making the film.
Yeah. I mean, I do wish that we had been able to get more African-American folks in the film. We had wanted to get Herbie Hancock, because he played at the jazz concert, and there's so few of the artists that played that day that are still alive, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But Herbie is based in LA, and we had this idea that we would eventually get out to LA for some shoots, and then, as you do with documentary films, we kind of just ran out of money and time, and it was not really about that, you know, we couldn't get those people. It was more we couldn't get to some of the people that we wanted to get to, because we did have a pretty limited, travel budget. There were very few people that said no. We had asked a couple of younger artists that I'd rather not say any names, but there were some people that we thought would be interesting to talk to and to bring some younger folks into the mix, but they declined because they felt like they didn't, know enough about Carter, because they were too young to know much, and decided not to speak. And the, it would be a favor to President Carter line didn't work on them, I guess.
Although I wonder about, what people in their 20s think about Jimmy Carter, what they would think about Jimmy Carter after seeing this film, because, if you think about Bernie, or, there's just certain aspects of Carter's, not to compare them because they're quite different people, but there's just something about that immediacy and kind of frankness and, availability as a person that I think would be appealing,
I think there were quite a number of people who liked Jimmy Carter and thought he was great, but just didn't feel they knew enough to be interviewed for a documentary about him.
Yeah, I do think that Carter has a tremendous amount of goodwill among the people that obviously, the people that spoke in the film, but even people that turned us down were nice about it.
I'm just wondering if anybody else here wants to put forward a question, because we don't have that many questions, and Q&A is part of, we have about 10 minutes left. And does anyone want to put a question into the chat?
There's a fellow.
Oh,
Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, hi, Andy.
Catherine. Hi, Catherine. Hi. This isn't really a question so much as a thought that I had listening to you all talk, that, I remember I was like, I don't know, 13 or 14 when Carter made that statement about country not being born, busy, country being born, not busy dying. And I was a huge Dylan fan even then. And it was so unreal to hear, a politician on, a person in the position of power talking, this language that had been, the language that you and your friends, it was like shared musical, like you said, counterculture. We were kids, but it was like, nowadays, obviously you can read articles about, Marvin Gaye and the Wall Street Journal. They'll have an article about what's going on or something, but that's the common culture now, but it wasn't back then. And it was so shocking, I think. And so
that's a very good point. It's hard to even explain now, where everything is crossed over, where engineers are running for office, that it was a complete fording of a huge river for Jimmy Carter in 1976 when he was running for president to be quoting Bob Dylan in his speeches. And only 2 years after Richard Nixon had been in the White House.
Exactly, yeah.
These people were at war. And, Dylan says in the film that it was the first time it had ever occurred to him when he met Carter in 74. And he quoted his lyrics to him and asked him specific questions about his songs. Dylan said it was the first time it had ever entered his mind that people like that in positions of power, at the time Carter was the governor of Georgia, were listening to his music, that they were even aware he existed. So you're right, it was a big cultural leap and a big cultural change.
Yeah, and it feels like not even like the beginning of it, because it took such a long time for it to really happen. It almost felt like an early, an outlier almost, because the next thing that I could think of would be something like Reagan, quoting Springsteen or misquoting Springsteen, which was so, horrifying, but then it sort of went underground again for a while.
Well, I think it's interesting to think about Carter being sort of an avatar for this thing of using, you know, popular music in a certain way to send a message, but also to lure people in and to cross boundaries and things like that. And then what we have now are so many people who abuse that idea, and then, you know, you having like musicians having to sue them to get them to stop using their
Stop
songs.
playing my song.
Right. You know, I mean, it's kind of interesting.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and so okay, there's a question here about did President Carter discuss Dizzy Gillespie with you guys at all? And of course, there's that great, you know, the salt peanuts.
Yeah.
We talked about jazz. We talked about Mingus. We talked about Cecil Taylor. I don't remember, Mary. Did we talk specifically about Dizzy?
Talked about singing Salt Peanuts with Dizzy Gillespie.
Right.
And because he and it's funny that, you know, we use a little bit of that in the film where he says, you know, the New York Times, it was the first time, how does he put it? Something about it was the first time that the New York Times complimented me on my rhythm. My timing, not on my tone, but on my rhythm. And he was definitely very proud of the fact that he got complimented on his performance of Salt Peanuts, because he mentioned that again to me later. He went, you know, when I saw him after the film was done, he was like, you know, that was the only time that I got a good review in the New York Times, basically. But you know, I think that he talked about that jazz concert as, you know, just how great it was for him to have, you know, all of those artists. And I don't know that and I remember, of course, he spoke a lot about Mingus, but I don't think he's had much else to say about Dizzy Gillespie that I recall.
I have a question for you. When you interviewed him, did you ever talk to him about his thoughts about the present moment?
He brought it up obliquely, but, you know, I think we didn't want to. I mean, that's how I felt, and I think that's how Mary and Chris felt too. It was almost disrespectful to President Carter to start asking questions about, you know, hey, what do you think about Donald Trump? Well, you know, I think we probably have a pretty good idea what he thought about Donald Trump.
I don't mean so much Donald Trump. I mean more that, you know, and sort of back to what Andy was just talking about how, you know, radical it was to hear that Dylan lyric at that time, and Carter kind of living through a specific moment in history, and also, you know, breaking boundaries right in that moment of history, as we've been talking about for the past hour. And it's just interesting for someone who's lived that long, as you pointed out, he's in his 90s now, to sort of hear what they think about the iterations of leadership, of political shift over time. You know what I mean? Because he has not only has he held that office, but he has a long view, having been on the planet for such a long time, and being so engaged for such a long time. I mean, just he's still out there. I'm sure if he could be out there lifting his hammer for Habitat for Humanity, he would be, right? And so he's embodied an ethic for a long time. So I was just curious, you know, what someone like that might think of the times we live in now.
I think he said to us that it's always a complicated time, and America is always an ongoing project. And whatever we think about the difficulties the country's going through now, think about what he saw growing up in Georgia in the 20s and 30s and 40s. So, you know, I think that's the thing I remember, Mary. I don't know if you remember anything else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Him kind of saying, stay the course.
Constantly changing, you know, history, and that they're going to be, you know, it's a cycle that we go through. I think when you live through life as long as he has, you see the cycle come around again, I guess, you know. But it was interesting how, you know, he talked about the basically like that, you know, music is kind of eternal, you know, that we will always connect with music, and he spoke about music like this sort of big ideas like truth and justice, and he equated the love of music with those kinds of principles that we hold, you know, dear, and I find that to be pretty powerful statement about the power of music.
Question.
Yes, go ahead. We're going to wrap up in a sec, but please, one more question.
Yeah, well, pursuant to that, it's like since the time of Dylan and the revolution that was happening at that time, the long hairs of Southern rock found their liberation and got to be the you know, patriotic renegades that they wanted to be. But now the definition of that patriotism has gone in two directions. And I was just wondering if he had any feelings or expressed any feelings about that, because some of these Southern rock people have gone in a totally different direction, has gone full MAGA. And patriotism now means two things to American Southern rock musicians, for example. I'm wondering if he expressed anything about that.
You know, I don't think we really got into that with him. I think that, you know, he talked about that we were in a divisive time. You know, he obviously recognized the divisiveness of the world that we're in now. But you know,
I think he might have made a reference to losing the support of Charlie Daniels between 76 and 80. And of course, Mary, I'm just, was it Larry Gatlin?
Yes.
Who remains an avid Carter supporter, but is a Fox News commentator and very conservative. And that's one of the things that, you know, we also need to remember is that Carter, when he appeared, didn't appeal only to liberals. In fact, a lot of liberals are very suspicious of him. He was representing the South. He was representing Georgia. He was the first president from the Deep South to be elected since before the Civil War. So there was a lot of Southern pride that might sometimes be manifest in other very different ways, was directed toward and through Jimmy Carter, at least in 76. It was probably a different story in 80 when he was running against Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, Larry Gatlin is an interesting character in our film because, you know, he showed up for the shoot
Packing heat.
Packing heat. He literally had a gun under his jacket the whole time. But he was like, I think it was in the 2016, he had, you know, sort of recently, I guess, released a song called Lock Her Up about Hillary Clinton's emails, you know, but he comes to sing Jimmy Carter's praises, you know, so go figure.
Gatlin gun, I guess.
Yeah.
It was a Gatlin gun.
Good old Gatlin gun. Well, I don't know. I think we're gonna wrap up this conversation, but it's been so great to hear from you.
Excuse me, Catherine, I just read that somebody just posted, Elise Trucks. Thank you so much for doing this. It was amazing to hear and watch. My father was a founding member of the Allman Brothers band.
Oh, wow.
And I grew up hearing stories about Jimmy Carter from Elise Trucks, obviously the daughter of Butch Trucks. So
that's so cool.
Thank you, Elise. That's very cool.
Thank you.
I wanted to chime in, but my son's toys are chiming in really loud.
That's okay. You can chime in with the toys.
Now, are you old enough to have been there at any of the Allman Brothers shows with Jimmy Carter?
I unfortunately no, but I was born under the Carter administration only just by a few months.
You slipped in.
Of that, and I have to say, you know, it was the thing that my father wished more people would have known about in his life. that and the thing that of which he was most proud was that he had a hand at putting Jimmy Carter in the White House. So for us to make the film, thank you.
That's
Well,
so lovely.
That's fantastic.
I want to talk a little bit too about art and politics and how such great art can become. Well, I want to talk about it, but I can't. I can't find the words. But I think about, Renaissance princes and the visual arts, the flourishing in Florence. And I think about the 70s music scene and the fusion music scene, which, yes, it does come from Black culture and it comes from jazz. And there's something about the artistry and the freestyle improvisation that jazz brought to American music that I think was really something he tapped into that was really meaningful. And I wish I could say something about that, but I think the film touched on that in a beautiful way. And
You're right, and at least that's a great point, and it brings us kind of back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, which is that Jimmy Carter rock and roll president means Jimmy Carter gospel president and jazz president and soul president and R&B president and spirituals president and American music, because the borders between American music have always been porous.
That's right.
And just like the borders between white people and Black people and Republicans and Democrats and red states and blue states are a lot more malleable than we like to think they are.
And I think music is obviously one of the most, the great connectors in our world of all of those folks. So that the film really ultimately is a love letter to the power of music,
Well, on that note, I don't think we could have ended on a better note. Thank you all so much for attending on behalf of CAA Arts Access. Patty, thank you so much for hosting us tonight. Mary, Katherine, and Bill/Dad, thank you very much for such a wonderful conversation. It really has just been an absolute delight. Jimmy Carter Rock and Roll President is streaming on HBO Max, Amazon, iTunes. I promise this is a non-biased opinion. A second, third watch really does show so much, and it really continues to be a beautifully relevant film in all of these wild times we find ourselves in. Thank you again for joining tonight, and see you out there in the world.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, Catherine.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Brilliant.
Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Elise, for sharing your stories also.
Yes.
Awesome.
And your son for his accompaniment. I enjoyed it. All right. Good night.